Thanks everyone for joining this session of the virtual seminars in economic theory. As always, we're very glad to see all of you. Today we have Stephen Callander from Stanford, who is going to give a presentation on market competition and political influence, an integrated approach. We are very pleased to have both Steve's co-authors, Dana Foarta and Takuo Sugaya, who will, as usual, take care of the questions of the chat room, and two guest panelists, Arjada Bardhi and Heski. By now, the format should already be familiar. We have a 60-minute presentation with time for interim questions from the panelists, followed by a 15-minute session for questions and discussions, led by our panelists, but the audience can also join in there as usual. We request all attendees to keep your microphones muted during the talk. However, please post comments and questions in the chat. Dana and Takuo will answer clarifying questions in writing, and if some questions are of a more pressing nature, then they will pass them on to Steve to facilitate a better flow in the discussion, in the presentation. Of course, there will be another opportunity to ask questions live in the Q&A questions at the end. Just for your information, as always, the talk is recorded. Before I hand over to Steve, let me remind you that these seminars take place every Thursday at 4 p.m. UK time. Next week, we will have with us Nima Harpana from Penn State, presenting the work Selling to a Group with Aditya Kuvalekar and Elliot Lipnowski, and guest panelists Alex Molin and Alice Pine. As usual, you can find more information about the coming list of speakers on our website or by following us on Twitter. Without much further ado, thank you, Steve. The digital screen, the online screen is yours. Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for having me. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen and we can get underway. All right, so great. So as Miltos said, this is joint work with my colleagues at Stanford GSB, Dana Foarta and Takuo Sugaya, who are both here on the call today. And what we're interested in this paper, as the title suggests, is the intersection, the interaction of politics and markets. Right? So it's clearly evident that these two domains are interdependent. Politics shapes the rules of the game for market competition that determine the ability of firms to operate and succeed in markets. And at the same time, market competition and the structure of market competition delivers profits to the firm that can be wielded in politics to obtain political influence. Right? So there is therefore a circularity between markets and politics. The outcomes of these two domains are interdependent, they're intertwined, and the relationship between them should evolve over time as market power changes or political power changes. And so the questions we're interested in this paper are sort of, what does this circularity imply for outcomes? All right, how does this codependence evolve, and what is this relationship over time? In particular, is there a feedback loop that develops between market power and political power such that power begets more power, such that initial advantages in ones and the market can be parlayed through political power into more market power, and so on into larger and larger market dominance? All right, so we're interested in that structure, that dynamic of the markets, and then therefore what this implies for the efficiency of markets, and also what does this imply for the operation of politics? What does this imply for the power and the influence of money within politics and its ability to distort political outcomes? And so these are the questions we're interested in. They're not idle theoretical curiosities. There is a growing debate around the world, particularly here in the United States, about the growing market power of the leading firms in the economy. And so particularly over the last 20 odd years, it's been documented that the larger firms have grown in market share and have grown in market power. And so the question that animates this debate is, why has this happened? Why have these firms been able to obtain more market power? And there's basically two possibilities for why they've been able to do this: a good reason and a bad reason. The good reason for why firms have obtained more market power is that they're just simply better at it than all of the other firms. right? And that one firm has just got a better capability, a better technology, a lower cost of production, such that it's better than all of the other firms in the market. And so it's efficient for that firm to take a larger share, or larger market share. That's one possibility as to why this has been observed. The other possibility is that this market power reflects not a capability advantage, but it reflects anti-competitive practices, that the market leaders are using anti-competitive strategies to block competition. And so for that reason, they're able to attain more market power, and this lowers the efficiency of the market. Right? This anti-competitive practices can take a variety of forms, but one big form it can take is to use political influence to block competitors in the market from being able to compete. So the question in this debate is, which is it? Why do we see increased market power? Is it for good? Is it the good concentration, or is it the bad concentration? All right. And so, which is it? How do we answer this question? It's very difficult to answer this question just by looking at the data. And so, what we need is a theoretical framework, a theoretical model that can inform these debates, so we can know what we should be able to infer from this data. Right. So, this is our objective in today's paper. So, we're going to build a political economy model. A political economy model with a real politics side and a real economic side. All right, so the market side is going to have two firms who compete period after period over time. And these firms in the market, just like in practice, have two potential sources of market power. One source of market power is capability based. They can just simply be better at producing in the market than the other firms. And so this is obtained via investment on technology, processes, routines, and so on. And this market power increases the efficiency of the market. The other source of market power firms can have in the model is political. They can lobby a policymaker to intervene in the market and give them an advantage. This sort of intervention doesn't improve the efficiency, it just blocks competition. And so therefore it's lowering the efficiency of the market output. Right. So that's the market side we're going to see. The lobbying is of a self-interested policymaker, standard political economy feature, who has available to her a tool to intervene in the market. And the tool she has available is to impose a sort of minimum technology floor or a minimum technology standard on the market. Right. So the idea is if the policymaker intervenes and imposes this technology standard, only the firms that are above, only the firm or the firms that have a technology above this level are able to compete, and everyone else is excluded from the market. And so this policymaker has the ability to intervene and block the lower firm from competing in the market. All right, so this is the setting we're going to study. And is that Heski?
Yeah, so just to slow you down, I mean, you could have chosen other tools. Is there a reason why this was the most natural one to put into the model, or most tractable, or whatever?
Yeah, so let me come back to that later. But absolutely, this is a big assumption. The tools that are available to the policymaker is an important assumption we're going to make here. And let me come back to it later. But what we're trying to get at is there's a tool that gives the policymaker power, but is not all-encompassing power. All right, so quite clearly, if you could do anything you'd want, you'd just write a long-term contract in which the policymaker would extract all of the surplus. And so in some sense, the power of the policymaker to intervene has to be limited. And so this is the way we're going to operationalize it.
But we could have done it, for example, by imposing a higher cost on the rival or something, like changing their marginal cost or whatever. I don't know. I mean, there's...
Yeah. So we can think of this as...
Maybe this is similar, but
yeah, so it is similar in that it's sort of like saying the lower technology firm has an infinite cost added to its marginal cost of production, so it's excluded from the market.
But I mean, one thing that this particular tool does, and maybe that's something we can come back to, is it means it's only ever going to be the better firm that's interested in lobbying.
Yeah, that's right. And so what sort of I shouldn't say a can of worms, but a question that gets opened up then is sort of, I'm the leading firm can lobby for protection. The trailing firm has to lobby to not have the leading firm protected. And there's just a very sort of unclear bargaining game that's going on there that we don't know how to model. And so this is a way of, as you just said, saying that it's the leading firm who wants to lobby and get protected. And we're going to impose that it's the only one who can make payments to the policymaker to get this protection. And so when you phrase the question as, is this the most natural? I think this is a natural way of doing it. But there are many other ways one could do it, as you're suggesting. And if anything, that's a separate question to try to understand what's that relationship between these firms and the policymaker, how does that bargaining game go on? And then separately, what is the tool available to the policymaker? What we've tried to go for, and you're right to stop me and sort of press me on this, what we've tried to go for is we have to make a choice and then study the environment. And the choice we're trying to make is where the policymaker has some power, but it's limited. And I can talk a bit more later on about sort of exactly what we need, but what we want, I'll come back to exactly what we need. The intuition for why this is what it is will become clearer.
Steve, can I follow up on that? I'm trying to understand how this tool interacts with the two-firm assumption. So supposing that I actually like the tool that you're giving to the policymaker, would it be much harder to have more than two firms, and the policymaker's choice not to be just to exclude one of the firms?
Yeah, so the way this is going to work, this tool only has some bite if it's between the level of technology levels of the firms, and it blocks the second one. If we had more, then there's a richer set of more firms. There's a richer set of possibilities of sort of how many get blocked from the market and so on. In principle, I don't see any problem with it, but tractability-wise, my co-authors can take it up in chat. But I imagine it's going to be difficult. But yeah, in principle, I don't think. I mean, in principle, there's no reason why this couldn't work a similar way with multiple firms, but it's just tractability is going to be very difficult at this point. All right, so yeah, so let me go on. So what we're trying to do is capture both the true political economy, I think, capture both the real economy part of it. So we're going to have Cournot competition with investment, a dynamic model of Cournot competition with investment. And then we're going to have this strategic policymaker. This is the political side of political economy, the strategic policymaker who can intervene in that market and distort or change the nature of competition and change the dynamic path. And so these are the two pieces we're trying to fit together. And the tool we give the policymaker, I think, is the cleanest way and a natural way of capturing that interaction. All right, so let me then tell you about the results we get, and then maybe a few things will become a little clearer. So what we do find is that there is a positive feedback loop that develops between market and political power, that power begets more power. An initial advantage in the market is parlayed into political power, which is then parlayed back into more market power and a further advantage into the market. And so that this reinforcing cycle does develop. However, what we show is that this reinforcing cycle, this feedback loop, is bounded, that the market reaches a point beyond which more capability-based market power actually leads to less political power. And so this feedback loop, is positive, but it's bounded and it stops before it gets too large. And so the reason why this happens, to understand why this feedback loop is bounded, we need to understand that the incentives in this game of the leading firm and the policymaker are aligned, but they're not perfectly aligned. Right? They're aligned in that if the policymaker protects the leading firm, she gets rents, which I'll tell you about in a minute. She gets rents and the leading firm gets to be a monopolist. And so statically, their interests are aligned, but dynamically, their interests are not aligned. And the reason why they're not aligned dynamically is that as the firm gets more and more ahead of its competitor in the market, as it gets a higher and higher capability advantage over the trailing firm, political power, political intervention just becomes less valuable to it. Right? If you're way ahead in the technology space over your competitor, you're not really constrained by competition very much. And so the value of political power is going down. Right? So what happens in this relationship between the leading firm and the policymaker is that they're aligned on protection, but the value of that protection itself is going down if the leading firm gets too far ahead of its competition. Right? And so what the policymaker then has to try to do is she has to try to manage competition, kind of restrain the lead of the leading firm so that she remains relevant, right? So that her power, her political power that she has by intervening in the market is still valuable. Right? And so for that to be valuable, she needs more competition in the market, more intense competition. And so that's why she sort of restrains the leader. And so what we find in the model is this sort of strong incentive for the policymaker to manage competition, and that's going to structure investment and market dynamics over time. Right. Now, at first blush, you might think that's a good thing, that this sort of interweaving of political and market power is bad, and so if we can shut it off, this is going to lead to better market outcomes. Right. But in fact, what we show is that it doesn't, and in fact, it leads to worse market outcomes. We get the worst of both worlds. We get less competitive markets in that there's protection offered, the policymaker intervenes in every period, and we actually get less investment or technology stagnation. And so this sort of effort by the policymaker to manage competition and the fact that this feedback loop is bounded actually sort of strangles the market and leads to worse outcomes than we would get if the policymaker weren't there. Or even if we had a monopolist in the market. All right. And so the reason why this happens and what we're getting at in this paper is that this interaction, the market structure changes the power and the value of the policymaker's tool to intervene in the market. And so there's this balance between competitive pressure and political power, and it's this evolving relationship that drives outcomes in the market as well as in the political sphere. And the main channel that this works through is that there's a threat of competition from the trailing firm. And that threat of competition is what makes political intervention powerful and valuable. And so there's this sort of changing intuition we get from how does competition affect market outcomes. In our model, that competition is intermediated by a policymaker. And what we show is that in this situation leads to a worse outcome. So in fact, to explore that intuition a bit more, hopefully at the end of my talk, I'll have time to get into a variant of the model where we relax the amount of competitive pressure in the market. And we'll show that that in fact leads to better outcomes in the market. And again, the reason is it's because that competition is intermediated by a policymaker, and that this upends or changes at least our standard intuitions from a market environment about how competition affects outcomes. All right, very good. If there are no questions, I'll jump into the details of the model. All right, so I've sort of given you the layout of the model. Now I'll just be a little bit more specific. So there are going to be two firms and a policymaker P. In each period, the firms compete in the market and they lobby the policymaker. So what I'm going to do is tell you now about the market, and then the specifics about the market, and then I'll tell you the specifics about the political environment. So for the purposes of today's talk, competition is Cournot in the market with linear demand. And now each firm has a technology level, tau, where the leader's level is given by L and the followers is by F. And that's how we're just going to refer to the two firms as the leader and the follower. And a higher tau, a higher technology level, leads to a lower marginal cost of production. Okay, so that's the capability-based market power that the firms are going to have. I'm going to work in terms of these profit functions. I'm not going to, in the talk, derive through the Cournot equilibrium. And so we're going to talk about the profit functions for the firms. And so pi L is the leading firm's profit function, given the technology levels L and F. And pi F is the following firm's technology level. All right. Now, as I've been talking about, the firms have a technology level and they can invest at cost C to increase their technology level, lower their marginal cost of production by 1 step. The cost of this investment is increasing in convex, so the amount of investment we're going to get in the model is going to be bounded. An improvement in each period is 1 step at a time. So you invest, you move up 1 step in the technology level, then we play the market and political game, and then we move on to the next period. All right, we also assume that the follower firm moves up 1 step in technology at no cost in every period it operates in the market. And so what we're assuming here is that if the follower firm is in the market, there's some catch-up growth, some learning by doing, some imitation of the leading firm that allows the following firm to step up one level in each period. And we're just, for simplicity, going to assume that comes for free. All right, so that's the market environment, Cournot competition with investment. And then
sorry, Steve, just for clarity, if the follower is not in the market, it doesn't, at least in the baseline model, it doesn't disappear, it just stays at the old follower level.
It stays at its technology level, yeah. And so we're imposing a connection between protection and investment here, that if the leader is protected and the followers are excluded, the follower can't advance technologically. All right, and I can...
No, that's fine. That's fine. I just think it's important for the audience to understand that's what's happening.
Good one. Thanks, Heski. All right. So here's the politics. I've given you the brief version before, and let me just state it again. So the policymaker has a tool, a very specific tool, which she can use to impose in the market, and it's a minimum technology standard. So if you don't meet that standard, you're not allowed to sell in the market in that period. Okay, and so this is obviously only has bite if it separates the firms, and so that's how you want to think about this. And we're going to refer to this as political protection. So if the policymaker intervenes, blocks the follower firm from the market, the leading firm has political protection. All right, so this is the source of political based market power, and it's gained by the leading firm from lobbying. With the trailing firm excluded, the leader's profit, it's now a monopolist. So using the superscript M, its profit is pi hat M of L. So with the trailing firm excluded from the market, it's a monopolist, and so it earns more profit. We assume that the policymaker's rents that she gets from offering protection are a fixed share of the benefit of that protection. And the benefit of that protection, therefore, is the difference between the monopoly profits the firm earns with the trailing firm excluded and the Cournot duopoly profits it would have earned if political protection hadn't been applied. Right? And so it's that gap, that difference, that's the value of political protection in this period. And so by offering political protection, the policymaker allows the leading firm to go from duopoly profits to monopoly profits, and then that benefit is shared between the leading firm and the policymaker according to a fixed share rho and 1 minus rho. So the policymaker's rents, pi of P for policymaker, are given to rho times the difference between monopoly and duopoly profits. The protected monopolist profit then, the leading firm who is protected and thus a monopolist, is then in a sense, the raw monopoly profits minus the rents it has to give to the policymaker. Right, so its profits are, duopoly profits plus the added rents of protection that it gets to keep for itself. Right. And we're assuming that there's, Heski, there's no contracting allowed. So as I mentioned earlier, you can't sign a long-term contract. So the policymaker has this specific tool and the rents are shared in this way within each period. Yes, Heski.
So I think this wasn't quite as clear to me reading it as it is now. So let me make a thing of it. The political decision is affecting the market in 2 ways. One is statically, that it's making it a monopoly and allowing this leader to make money. But the other is this dynamic one that we're not allowing the follower to move up a level by having it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of hardwired into what political protection means. And the nature of the tool doesn't allow us to separate these two out. And that's related to the last bullet, I guess.
Yeah, so absolutely. And so this is how we do it. And let me then sort of step back and give you a rationale for why it has to be done in some way. So if there isn't the dynamic linkage, then the equilibrium is clear, given the incentives we have, which is the policymaker just protects every period. The leader's a monopolist. They get these extra rents and they share it. I could tell you the equilibrium straight off the bat. That's what it's going to be. All right? Because if there's no dynamic distortion, then the static strategy is optimal. Just protect, get more rents. All right, so there has to be some sort of dynamic cost to that protection. What we're doing is we're keeping that dynamic cost all within the market, which is the trailing firm can't catch up. I mean, another way you could do it instead of enriching the market side, to enrich the political side would be to say there's an election coming up, and every time I protect, I'm more likely to lose the election in the next period. All right, so I won't be dogmatic that this is the only way to use your phrasing earlier. This is a natural way of doing it. It's not the only natural way of doing it. But what is clear is that there has to be some sort of dynamic cost to this protection.
Steve, can I ask something about the rows? So the row is exogenous and it's constant over time. So it's got both things sort of. Do you want us to think of these rows as coming from some bargaining process that you're not modeling here?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Do I have a specific bargaining model in mind that will produce these rows? You know, I can try to give you that, and we have some answers, but not specifically. But that's how we're thinking about it. This is some sort of balance, bargaining weights between the policymaker and the leader. Right. What we do want, and to sort of give you an answer like I gave Heski, is what we do want from this relationship is that the rents the policymaker gets are a function of the competition in the market. That's the kind of key intuition and the key mechanism we're trying to get at. That as the difference between monopoly and duopoly profits changes, the policymaker's rents change as well. Right? That's what we need, and that's what we want. And this is the simplest way of getting at that. I will bet you $100 I could write down a bargaining model that would give me enough constraints on this row to get this, but I'm not going to give it to you today. All right, and that's what we really want to get at, this relationship between markets and politics, that as the market competition changes, the rents the policymaker get changed. And we think that this is a very natural relationship, that as the technology leader gets further and further ahead, the value of political protection is going down. All right. And I'll come back to that point in 2 slides when I give you one more assumption. All right, so here's the timing of the game. So within each period, the leading firm has an opportunity to invest. If it invests, its technology level goes up 1 step. The policymaker gets to decide whether to protect or not. Then we have market competition. If the policymaker doesn't protect, we've got Corno duopoly. If she does protect, we've got a monopoly. And then in the last transition phase, the trailing firm moves up 1 step if it's in the market and not otherwise. Okay, very good. All right, so we're going to have a far-sighted policymaker who discounts at rate delta. In the main model, the firms are going to be relatively myopic and discount completely from period to period. And in the appendix, we show that these results, the main insights are robust to far-sighted firm. But notice that the investment and the payoff from investment are all within the 1 period. So the leading firm does still invest because it moves up a step and it earns higher profits within a period. So we do have we have enough foresight to farsightedness to capture that incentive. We're going to identify a renegotiation proof subgame perfect equilibrium, and then we're going to show you that this is prove that this is unique and prove that it's a Markov perfect equilibrium. All right, so I'm just going to refer to the equilibrium hereafter. I need to give you one more assumption, which will clarify a little bit of that last answer I was just giving to Arjada. So this relationship between the leader's technology advantage and the rents that the policymaker get, all right, it's very intuitive that as the leader gets further and further ahead, the value of protection goes down. All right. In an aggregate sense, this comes out of Cournot competition, but we need to make this assumption one, that it holds at every step. So like at every step that you move, the leader moves up, the rents the policymaker gets are going to go down. All right, the value of political protection is going down for every step the leader advances technologically, keeping the follower fixed. All right, so it's saying that the value of, just to say it again, the value of protection is declining in the leader's advantage. All right, you can look at that simple expression in assumption one and you can rearrange it. And what it's really saying is that the marginal profit to a monopolist of investing is less than the marginal profit to a duopolist from investing. That's what this relationship is saying. The duopoly profit is sort of, as the leader gets further and further ahead, duopoly profit is catching up to the monopolist. All right, so the duopolist therefore has a greater incentive to invest. All right, that's interesting and important for us because that's really, in essence, what the famous arrow replacement effect is assuming. So the arrow in the early 60s made the claim that there's a greater incentive to invest in duopoly. And the reason is that because a duopolist invests, all right, it gets a better technology, a lower cost of production, but it's also capturing market share from its competitor. All right, and so it's that additional ability to capture market share and to lower competition against the competitor that provides a spur and an incentive to invest. All right, whereas a monopolist just gets the benefit of a lower cost of production. A duopolist gets lower cost of production and captures market share. It escapes competition. And so that's why a duopolist has a stronger incentive to invest. And so really all we're doing is just saying, let's take arrow replacement effect as true. And that's enough to give us this relationship between market structure and the policymaker's rents. All right. Let me move on. We make a small assumption about a step size, but let me move on because I want to get to the main proposition before we run out of time. All right, so let me give you, and this is where I need to move along, give you two benchmarks before we get to the main proposition. All right, so we can understand what's going on in the mechanics of this model. So the first benchmark is to suppose that the policymaker never intervenes. Right, so now we just have a duopoly model. The logic of investment in a duopoly model is I invest if the profit of investing and moving up to technology level L+1 minus the cost of investing is greater than the profit if I just stayed where I was. Right. Very, very simple. Right. We can think about that, or we can see that graphically, and these are graphs I'm going to use for the remainder of the talk. So what we have on this graph is on the horizontal axis is the leader's technology level, and on the vertical axis is the followers. Right, so when the leader invests, we move horizontally from one state to the next state. And if the follower catches up, we move vertically. If they both advance, we're going to move diagonally. And if no one advances, we stay where we are. So we're going to be very much working in this sort of lower half of the positive quadrant here, because this is where the leader is ahead of the follower by definition. All right. And so what we find in this setting, in the duopoly setting, is that the leader invests as long as the follower's level is below an incentive, below this constraint ICD, which is incentive compatibility constraint for a duopolist. And what we show is that this threshold is decreasing in L. Right, so what that means is that the leader invests for all the states below that threshold, but once the market advances beyond that threshold, once the leader and the followers level, technology level reaches a state beyond that threshold, they stop investing. Okay, so we can think about what would happen in this market if we started at the origin. Well, the leader gets an opportunity to invest in the first period. He invests, we move to state 1-0. They compete corno because the follower's in the market, he catches up, they move, the follower catches up, the leader invests again. And so we essentially sort of move along this line of slope 1 until we hit the investment threshold, at which point the leader stops investing because it's no longer profitable. The follower catches up, we move back to the 45-degree line, and we corno compete thereafter. All right. So that's what happens with no political protection, and that's the sort of market dynamic we get. We can do the same thing for a monopolist. Right? So we've got very much the same thing for the monopolist. It's profitable to invest if the profit from investing minus the cost exceeds the profit of not investing. Right? Except now we've got superscripts M for monopolist. And what we find very similarly is that this investment satisfies a very similar constraint, an IC constraint for the monopolist, and this too is decreasing. And then the arrow effect tells us that, let me just give you the graph, the monopoly constraint occurs below the duopoly constraint. Right? The duopolist has more incentive to invest, so investment goes on longer. Right? So the market with never protect has the higher constraint, always protect is the lower constraint. And then what happens in this market if we start at the origin? Well, the leader invests, it's protected, so the follower never catches up, the leader invests again, and so on. And so the market moves along the horizontal axis until we run into this, until we pass this constraint, and then they stop it. And then it stops investing, and that's the end of the market. All right, very good. So that's what happens under monopoly and under duopoly. Now I want to tell you, well, what happens with a strategic policymaker? And what we find is that, as I mentioned at the start, things are worse. Right? So starting at the origin, the long run steady state with a self-interested and strategic policymaker is given by a state L star 0, where, as you can see as I've plotted on the graph, L star is strictly to the, well, it's to the left of where we would be even with a monopoly. Okay. So what we're getting is we're getting protection in every period, and then investment stops at a level that's lower than not just duopoly, but it's lower than monopoly. I can give you the expression for what that L star must be. It has to be less than the monopoly level. That's the inverse of IC M0, and also less than this other level given by L hat, which is derived from a constraint on the policymaker's preferences, which I'll explain in a minute. All right. So very good. So as I just mentioned, so what happens? The dynamic path, if we start at the origin, just moves along the horizontal axis until it hits this green dot, and then it stops. And so what we're getting with a strategic policymaker is this worst of both worlds. There's never competition on the equilibrium path because the leader is always protected. And moreover, we get lower investment than we would get if we guaranteed monopoly to the leading firm. All right, so this interaction between the policymaker and the leading firm actually undermines investment, so it stops at a weekly earlier level and potentially much earlier level than we get in monopoly. All right. So what I hope to do now is explain to you why this happens. Why does investment stop so early? Right? And so to understand why it stops so early, we need to look at what this other constraint is in proposition 1. And so what you'll notice is that it's a trade-off, or it's an equality for the policymaker, and it's saying her profit from the leader being at L hat and the follower being at 0 is equal to the discounted value of the leader being at L hat and the follower moving up one level. All right, so it's sort of like, do I want rents today at one level, or do I want higher rents tomorrow with the follower catching up one step? All right, and it's this constraint, this simple trade-off, that's going to define this equilibrium level in proposition 1. And so to understand why that is, I can sort of put it back into my graph. And in fact, this one period trade-off for the policymaker we can do the same thing at all different levels of the follower and the leader and generate a constraint for the policymaker given by this vertical line. Not vertical line, this line of slope 1 with the red box at the end. All right, and so what you'll notice is that this line is the indifference curve for a policymaker between getting rents at LF today versus getting rents tomorrow, therefore discounted, with the follower catching up one period. Right, so what this is saying is, does the policymaker prefer to take rents today, or does she want to give up rents today, let the follower into the market, let it compete, let it catch up technologically, and therefore get higher rents tomorrow? Right. And so what we find is, or what holds here, is that this constraint defines when the policymaker is willing to wait for more rents versus when she wants to just take rents today. Right. Below this threshold, the policymaker is willing to wait because the follower is so far behind there, the rents aren't very high. She wants to let it catch up. But above that constraint, the rents are high enough and the policymaker is impatient enough that she says, all right, I'm going to protect today, take these rents. Consequently, the follower won't catch up anymore. Right? So it's that trade-off in the policymaker's incentives that's the starting point for understanding what happens in this model. All right. Now, given that constraint and given the monopoly constraint, the ICM constraint, let's start to consider states around those thresholds. So take this green dot that is on the screen now. Right. So this green dot, this state, this level of L and F, is above the policymaker's patience threshold. Right. So that means the policymaker is willing to, she wants to take rents today rather than wait anymore. Right. So she is willing to protect and just get those rents. It's also above the monopoly threshold. And so if the leading firm is going to be a monopolist, it doesn't want to invest. Right. So in fact, the equilibrium there is going to be the monopolist doesn't invest, the policymaker protects, and we just stay there forevermore, all right? Because we don't advance. The leader doesn't invest, so we don't move right. The follower is out of the market, so we don't move up. Right. So that green dot's going to be a stable point, right, for the reasons I just articulated. Right. Now what we want to think about is, given that stable point, what happens for states below that? Right. If we go to this state, directly below it and across these thresholds, if we ever get there, we can say that the policymaker won't protect, right, because it's below her patience threshold. The definition of the threshold is she doesn't want to take rents at that state. She'd rather wait till tomorrow and get higher rents tomorrow. So we know if we ever get to that bottom circle, the policymaker won't protect and she'll wait to get to the higher rents tomorrow. Right. That's important, not for necessarily what the leader does there, but it's important for what the leader does at the state to the left of that. All right. So now at the state to the left of that, the leader thinks to himself, if I invest, the state will move right. The leader won't protect me because she'll want to wait for it to move up to a higher state. All right. And so I know that if I invest, I'll be in a duopoly and I'll have to compete with the following firm. Fair enough. All right. So she says, if I invest, I'm going to compete. I'm below the duopoly threshold, remember, it's higher than this one. So if I'm in a duopoly, I should invest. The difference, however, is what happens if the leader doesn't invest? If the leader doesn't invest, we're above the policymaker's patience threshold. All right. And so the policymaker says, this is great. I'd rather take rents today than let the following firm in and move up a state. Right. So if the leader doesn't invest at this bottom left dot, the policymaker will protect. Right. So now you think about the choice of the leader firm. If he invests, he moves up a level, but he has to compete with the follower. He's in a duopoly. But if he doesn't invest, he gets to be a protected monopolist. In our model, that means the leader is not going to invest. And I went through it earlier. There's a small step size assumption. And what that is saying is that these technological increments are small enough that it's not like a breakthrough innovation whereby I'd rather be a competitor with a much better technology. All right. I'd rather be a monopolist at one technology level than a duopolist at a higher technology level. And so what we get here is that the leader at this lower left green dot, the leader doesn't invest. All right. And now notice that's important because what it's saying is we're below the monopoly threshold, but still the leader is not investing. All right. So that's the origin of this distorted investment. And the way to understand that is to connect back to the arrow replacement effect that I mentioned earlier. And what we refer to this as is we say what we've identified is a reverse arrow effect. Right? So the arrow replacement effect is if I invest, I capture some of your market share, I'm escaping competition in a sense. All right, so I'm escaping competition, and the Agion has a paper where they use that language. I'm escaping competition. And so consequently, that gives me more of an incentive to invest. So a duopolist will invest more than a monopolist. What we've identified here with a strategic policymaker is that if you invest, you lose political protection. And so consequently, by investing, you get more competition. Right? And so consequently, that leads to a lower incentive to invest and a sufficiently lower incentive to invest such that a protected monopolist will invest less than a guaranteed monopolist. So what we're showing is that this political intervention sort of adds a step to the arrow logic. And so it then flips the causal chain. So instead of investment leading to less competition, investment here is leading to more competition. And so that's why we get this distorted investment. And what's really going on here is at the blue dot, the policymaker is trying to manage competition. The policymaker is saying, I don't want the leader to get too far ahead. I need the follower to catch up. So I'm still relevant. So I can still get lots of rents. What happens is the leading firm anticipates the policymaker managing competition and says, well, how about I just stop investing before you try to manage competition? And so the leader stops investing earlier, gets protected, right? It's happy, the policymaker is sort of happy, but the problem is the problem for society and the whole market is that the investment is distorted and it's stopped at a lower level. All right. So very good. So that's that reverse arrow effect is the logic of what goes on in this model. Right? All I've shown you so far is how it works at a few states right around this intersection. Right? But what you'll notice is that logic that I just outlined is going to unravel further and further back down my graph. So I had a green dot above, a blue dot below, and a green dot to the left. If I go down from the green dot again, I'm below the threshold. The same logic applies. The policymaker will manage competition. So to the green dot to the left, the leader says, I'm going to stop investing here. Right? And so what we show in the paper is this reverse arrow effect we've identified in this little range actually unravels all the way back to the horizontal axis. And that's why investment stops without the follower ever competing. The policymaker will manage competition if the leader invests any more, right? But consequently, the leader stops investing beforehand. Now, you might be saying this picture I have depends upon the slope of this curve. It absolutely does. If you want to go to our proof, in the appendix, we'll show you how to do it for all different slopes. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter so much. All right, the same sort of logic works. It's just a little more involved. All right. So very good. So just to sort of wrap up this proposition one, which is our main result in the paper, what we've identified is this incentive of the policymaker to want to manage competition to remain relevant. This bounds the feedback loop. So protection will be turned off if the policymaker if the leader gets too far ahead. But the leader anticipates this, creating a reverse arrow effect. And this interaction undermines investment. So what happens in the equilibrium then is that in every period, the follower is excluded from the market. The follower never gets to compete. But what's important here is that the follower is always standing ready to compete, because that provides the material for the policymaker's threat. The policymaker says, in equilibrium, if you invest any more and we cross this threshold, I'm going to remove protection and let the follower in, and it'll catch up. All right.
Steve,
and so what's, yeah, go for it.
Sorry, if you want to finish that line of thought.
It's fine, it's a good spot.
So going back to something that you said about the fine grid and how fine of a grid you need for this argument. So does this mean that in markets in which we have more disruptive innovation, we need not worry about this political channel?
I will not say we need not worry about it, but yeah, to elaborate a little more. So the policymaker, the leading firm's choice is, I'm at level L. If I invest, I'm going to have to compete. And so, but I will be at a higher technology level. And so, you know, is that trade-off good for me? And we've assumed that these technology steps are small enough. Another way of phrasing it is not giant, then this should work. It's not like we need epsilon steps or anything like that. They just don't need to be giant, because the difference between monopoly and duopoly is pretty significant. And so we just need this technology jump to not outweigh that. But then that does imply, if there is a technology breakthrough, like if what I'm investing in is a disruptive innovation that allows me to jump way up, then maybe I would still do it. All right, I'd still do it because I don't care if I have to compete against you. I'm just so far ahead, it doesn't matter. And so one might suggest that, you know, we're going to get a model of, you know, maybe that's why we see why so much innovation is disruptive innovation. Now, I'm making an empirical claim. I don't know whether it's true or not, but you know, that would create that sort of distortion. This sort of political protection may not be so relevant when you have such a big step available.
Thanks. That does sound like an argument of, you know, another channel, just like Arrow's argument of escaping competition. That does sound like disruptive innovation might be a way to escape this
so
political channel.
Yeah, and that's a function of the tool that we have available. So we do have we are sort of talking about some ideas around that sort of thing. But yeah, it's right. It's definitely, if you were a firm and you're looking, if you get to choose how risky or what's the variance of the investment you're making, you would go for the really big ones, because you not only have to escape competition against your competitor, you have to escape the power of the politician. And that's, I think, is a very fair argument. All right, so very good. So my slide advanced on its own. So where I was going, so that last result is our main proposition. What I want to spend the last 4 or 5 minutes on is to talk about to explore this logic with the second result, which I'll give you the overview of. And so
can I just come back on that last point, if it's okay?
Go for it.
So the assumption here is that the politician can't do expropriation directly. I mean, you might think in the sort of world that you were describing, when they do spectacularly well, we just take it. Yeah, we just impose some punitive tax or whatever. So the sort
it is a function of the tool that's available. Yes. Yeah. So our tool is only,
and for those breakthroughs, it's not hard to imagine other tools that politicians might want to introduce.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very much so our politicians' power comes in the difference between the firms. And so if you can get a big gap there, you'll be in better shape. But it's right. Then maybe I just come in and expropriate your entire firm. All right, maybe that's what, anyway. All right, so what I was getting at was, the threat of competition is what gives the policymaker power. The threat of letting the entrant in is what allows the policymaker to say, give me lots of rents, because otherwise I'm going to unleash competition on you. And what I showed in proposition 1 is that power actually distorts investment and leads to bad outcomes. Right? So a lot of competitive pressure leads to bad outcomes. And that raises the question about, well, if competitive pressure was lower, right, would outcomes potentially be better? Right? And so what we want to do is to develop a model, a variant of the model, to try to explore that intuition. Right? And so it's sort of changing our normal intuitions about markets, where more competition leads to better outcomes, all right? But what happens here, it's intermediated by the strategic policymaker. So what we do is we develop a simple variant of the model that gets complicated enough. And the variant is to say that the follower firm will permanently exit the market if it's been excluded for K periods. So in other words, if you're sitting there as the follower and you're always excluded from the market, at some point you're going to give up and just go do something else. Right? So if you've been excluded for too long, you just give up and leave. And then if you leave, the policymaker doesn't have any, the key intuition is if you leave, the policymaker doesn't have the threat of unleashing competition. The policymaker's tool becomes useless in that situation. And so that's the potential for the following firm to leave changes the policymaker's incentives. All right. And so what we did then is show a result, which is that in the long run, in the steady state of this market, this actually leads to much better outcomes. All right. In the steady state, there is monopoly, but there's monopoly without political protection. Right. But moreover, that monopoly level is at that steady state technology level is at a higher technology level than we got in Proposition 1. It's also higher than what we got with what you'd get with a monopolist, like a permanent monopolist, and it's even higher than what you can get with duopoly. Right. Along the path as well, we get lots of periods of competition. Right. So whilst the long run equilibrium steady state in this market is still monopoly, right, the efficiency of that market along the path and at the steady state is much higher than it is in Proposition 1 when the entrant is always there. Right, so what we're showing is you sort of dial down the competition, that dials down the power of the policymaker's tool, and that changes the relationship between the leader and the policymaker that unleashes competition. I only have a couple of minutes, so let me just give you two pieces of intuition to get at that. All right. Quite clearly, what's going to happen is that we're never going to stabilize very far from the 45-degree line, right? Because what the policymaker has then is, if I keep protecting the leader for K periods, the follower drops out, I get no rents. So at the Kth period, I'm going to let the follower in, sort of renew these K periods and get more rents, K periods, more rents. So we're always going to sort of leak up towards the 45-degree line in this model. And that itself is a good incentive. And we're getting competition in every one of those periods. All right. What I want to show, let me just give you my final picture, is why we can get competition above the 45-degree line is that to connect back to the arrow logic, this sort of model generates what we call an enhanced arrow effect. So once you get to the 45-degree line, the policymaker can't protect, right, because the firms are at the same technology level. And so the policymaker isn't getting any rents and they're in duopoly. But if one of the firms were to invest, if the selected firm were to invest, then it would have a technology advantage and the policymaker could protect. Right. And so what we find is a sort of flip of our earlier logic, which is if you don't invest, you're not protected. If you do invest, you're protected. And so this is really enhancing or superpowering arrow in the sense that I'm not only sort of escaping a little bit of competition by investing, but I'm getting rid of my competitor altogether. And so what we show is that this sort of interaction can actually lead to more investment even above the duopoly threshold, because the investment is changing the level of that competition. All right. Anyway, so I'm out of time. I don't want to carry on too long, but what I do want to do is just sort of wrap up and sort of emphasize what we've done here. So we do make a bunch of assumptions, as every model does, but what we're doing is taking two different settings and sticking them together and in a fully dynamic model. So to make that work, we need to make some specific assumptions. Those assumptions capture this intuition that the relationship between political and market power changes in the market structure, and that's really what we're trying to capture. And then we document what that relationship looks like given the particular tool that's available to the policymaker. All right, we think there's obviously a lot of other things you can do here, right, and a lot of other ways of modeling this interaction and understanding it. And we sort of very much look forward to doing some of those papers ourselves and having other people do them as well. All right. What we want you to take away is sort of on this final question, is concentration or good or bad? And the sort of answer is you can't just look at the steady state. In a sense, in sort of you look at the steady state in either market, and it's always a monopolist, right? But what you need to do is understand, is that state good or is that state bad, is to understand the sort of competitive pressure and the interaction that led to those different steady states. All right. So on my clock, it's 9:01, well, it's 5:01 on your clock. So let me stop there and throw it open for questions.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for the very nice presentation and the questions by the panelists. We can start the Q&A session where our panelists can ask more questions.
Arjada, you want to go ahead, or you want me to?
Sorry?
Either way, Heski, I can go.
Go ahead, yeah.
Thanks. So
Okay.
let me perhaps ask something clarificatory on your previous slide, Steve. So when we're looking at the steady state in the extension, can you also characterize the path that gets us to that steady state? And are there multiple such paths, or?
Yeah, so good question. So I was out of time, so I didn't want to overburden the audience. But yeah, what we do is we aren't able to characterize the whole path, but we can characterize what the steady state, what are steady states. And so what we show is that the only steady states have this property that they're sort of above the duopoly threshold, and that they're one step away from the 45-degree line.
I see.
And so
Thanks.
This picture was meant to show, like, we know parts of the path. So once you pass the duopoly threshold, it sort of moves straight up. But we don't know what the path is below that, and it varies.
I see. Because I'm trying to understand whether I should think of the steady state here as a long-term feature as something that we should be worrying about in the long term. And if this stabilizes pretty quickly, perhaps that's not as much of a concern. So that's where my question is coming from. But
yeah, so in my picture, if you guys can see my mouse, it's the steady state is going to be one of these states sort of right off the diagonal here. And so basically what happens is you keep moving back to the diagonal. The leader, the policymaker is happy to let them go back to the diagonal because she knows one of them will invest and she'll be able to protect again.
yes.
Until we get past this higher threshold, this L double star, because after that, neither of them will invest, even with the promise of political protection. And so that's why in the last period, before we go back to the diagonal, the policymaker just protects for K periods, and then the follower permanently exits. All right, so I can use this opportunity to say one more thing about that steady state. So in that steady state, there is just one firm and there's no competitors and there's no political protection. There's no rents being paid to the policymaker. So if you looked at that steady state, just as an outside observer, and said, is this good concentration or bad concentration? You would say it's good concentration. Look how advanced this firm is. And you would say, there's no evidence of political interference here. Look, there's no competitors. The politician is getting no rents. This is the perfect capitalist outcome. This is the perfect good concentration. But what we've shown is that if you look, what we do know about the path is we never cross the 45. So it's always this initial advantage, this initial investment locks in your long run benefit, your long run position. And so in a sense, there's no competition. The leaders, the identity of the winner is locked in after the first period.
But this might be even better for consumers than if there was no political influence.
It might be even better than for consumers, yes. Right. And so, and that's what we're trying to say. But the point I'm trying to make now is you can't infer from the state.
I get that, but it doesn't mean that there's a problem either.
No, that's true.
So could I say a few things? Is that so? Let me start from the very small, which is I think it's absolutely awesome to have a presentation that doesn't mention related literature at all. So if I was looking for related literature, and I think I've said this to you before, and I think this is related to this last component, I'd look at kind of trade policy. So, I mean, it's always are and where they're coming from and what they're doing, and whether they're disappearing or not. They weren't at all before, and now they are in a deterministic way. But one place they don't disappear is if they're operating in some other country. And so I think it's not unnatural to think about kind of trade policy in these environments, especially as that's an environment where the policy tool is relatively easy to calibrate industry by industry. So that was sort of one observation, if you like. That last observation wants me to go to the big picture, and then I'll stop. So the big picture now, I mean, you'd have to live in a cave not to have heard that antitrust policy in the world is being shaken up. Lina Khan and Tim Wu and neo-Brandesians taking over the world, and whatever else it is. And these are guys who are interested in power over consumer surplus measurements. Now, one thing that I think is so there's a few things that are super interesting about that. I haven't read Tim Wu's book. I spent the summer reading the Vanderbilt biography and the Matt Stoller book and History of Regulation. There's a Tom McCraw book that's very nice on that as well. And one thing so there's a few things that come out. I mean, one thing is that the follower might pay is the story of Vanderbilt. There was a monopoly concession that he broke. So I think that's a kind of interesting observation. Another thing that comes out of that, I think, is that antitrust isn't specific to an industry, that these waves come at the kind of economy level as a whole. So, right now people are upset about Google and Amazon, and the outcome is that hearing aids are suddenly going to become more competitive. That's the first thing that we've got coming out. So I think, there's papers to be written about this happening as a political system, as waves of antitrust getting stricter or less strict, that are not so tied to a sort of specific industry and a relatively small looking tool. I mean, I think so this isn't about this paper. This is about, I'm super curious in what these neo-Brandesians are saying, and I'm not sure that they're going to be fully satisfied with this as a model of what's going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, you should read Tim Wu's book. It's only about 60 pages, Heski. All the other ones you read sounded much longer. So,
they were, yeah, but they're awesome.
The trade example is one we talk about in the paper, and we think this is exactly as you describe. It's sort of a perfect fit for proposition one, and that the second.
Well, except that what's going on with the follower is a little bit more subtle.
Yeah, that's the tool, and the sort of negotiating game is richer. That's for sure. But when I say it's a fit for proposition one, it's that the trailing firm is always there ready to compete, even though it's not allowed into the market, and that's because it's just selling in its home market. And sort of one thing we think, and we've been sort of reading up on as well, is how would you do that then? How would you create that sort of situation domestically? Well, what you would want to do as the policymaker is you don't want to exclude the following firm completely. What you want to do is you need to keep it active in some sense so that it's ready to pounce if you turn protection off. And so what you'd need to do is to have the follower sort of limited to segments of the market.
You create sub-markets, yeah.
You create sub-markets, and you say to the follower, you can play in that game, in those markets, so that you're still there and you're ready to compete if I need you, but I'm going to exclude you from the main market and extract rents there. But trade is the cleanest way.
By the way, another nice example for that might be military procurement, where there's sort of rules on making sure that there's enough people alive. Like they worry about that competition.
Yep. All right. We're starting to look into procurement. I hadn't looked
procurement into more generally, but I think for the US military, it's like we need multiple bidders is a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Good suggestion. We'll have a look at that. And then what we do find in trade, and there actually is some data on trade, is that it's very sort of industry specific, this trade protection, that sort of the more fragmented is a market, the the less likely the firms are to overcome their collective action problem and the less protection they get. And so the protection in trade is applied very much market to market, and it's applied as a function of the ability of the firms in that market to influence the policymaker. Now, so that's there. Now, to create an analogy to the Neo-Brandeisians, of course, sort of at a macro level, the relationship between the US and Japan, the US and China is also creating waves of, you know, how likely are we to do a deal with these countries in these regions goes up and down, right? But within those waves, there's still a lot of the variation within those industries, and how it plays out industry by industry is what we're trying to get at.
No, I get that. I'm just saying I'm also interested in what's driving those waves in antitrust and the extent to which that's related to what's happening at these industry levels. Is that spilling out or not? I don't know. I mean, I think there's interesting things to be said, and I don't know. I'm not arguing that it's for this paper, but I think there are big questions out there.
Yeah. So in terms of the Neo-Brandeisians, it sounds like we're in more agreement, which is there are these waves. We're not saying anything about the waves, but we're just saying given that context, this is how it plays out. Now, the wave is going to affect our model. If the wave of antitrust affects sort of how easy it is for a policymaker to extract rents without losing elections.
So you can think about that a way of pinning down Roe. Pinning down Roe,
yeah. So that one could think of the wave changing Roe. It just makes it harder to extract rents without getting thrown out of office and getting embarrassed. And so that can create variation, but our mechanism is then still going on. But yeah, these waves are affecting Roe. And I think that's probably a fair way of thinking about it. Like when I think about the Neo-Brandeisians in Tim Wu's book, it's all about how government, about this lobbying, these firms pushing for political protection is just ex ante. It's just bad per se. It's just terrible bad. Now, I didn't really get into it, but this last result that's on the screen, the fact that this could be good for consumers is because political intervention is actually creating an enhanced incentive to invest. Right? This enhanced arrow comes from political intervention. So one thing we can say to the Neo-Brandeisians is that sort of we know from economics, like there's an externality here. There's not enough investment in markets. Firms just don't invest because they're not internalizing the social benefit of their investment. Right? So straight up economics tells us there's insufficient or inefficient amounts of investment. What this result is getting at is that, well, one part of what it's saying is that political intervention can solve that market failure and lead to more investment and more inefficient outcomes. Now, if you looked at it in a Tim Wu perspective, he'd say this is corrupt and it's terrible. And I'm not going to say all political intervention satisfies this, but one thing it is saying is that political intervention, the award of market power essentially can work like a patent. It can award market power to a firm that invests, and then that can actually lead to better outcomes. All right, but that's sort of a more of a minor addendum I would add to what they're doing. But sort of Tim Wu's book's largely about how these firms are taking over politics and they have political power for its own sake. In our model, it's all market driven. It's all profit driven. The firms are operating and accumulating political power just for market power.
I get that. So in Stoller's book, the bogeyman is Andrew Mellon, right? So and Andrew Mellon, big steel magnate, also Secretary of the Treasury for something like 15 years or whatever it is. And I think the modern day equivalent, there's a lot of Italians here who'll have much stronger views about this than me, but Berlusconi, who has issues in the industry that lead him into politics to get out of them. So and then those things sort of spill out to more than one industry, and that's sort of what I don't know. I mean, your paper doesn't have to be about everything, but I think these are some of the issues that they worry about.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, it's sort of, we can think of this as the micro within industry effect, and you're talking about sort of macro waves. And
yep,
you're correct. We're not saying anything about that, and I agree very much that it's an interesting question about. So if this happens in every industry, does that fundamentally change politics? Is sort of Tim Wu's what he's getting at.
Can I make two more general remarks, high level? Miltos, I don't think I hear you.
Sorry, no, I was about to say that Francesco, I think, has a question, but I'm sure he can wait until you ask yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. So very nice presentation, Steve. So a very, very beautiful mechanism and very clean. I was looking for electoral cycles in the model, and for the purpose of the model, I was interpreting delta as a replacement probability. But if we were to take electoral cycles a bit more seriously and model them as some sort of deadline that policymakers face in this framework, I'm wondering. So obviously that ties the hands of the policymaker and may restore some competition in the market, perhaps. So I'm wondering whether you can say anything about the codependence of these competition cycles and electoral cycles, and I guess another layer of this is campaign financing, and whether you have any thoughts. Obviously, this is a way outside the scope of the model, but whether you have any thoughts about campaign financing and how these firms might actually might have incentives to also choose particular policymakers in office. Now, of course, you don't have here, the policymaker is the same, right? So I'm thinking about a world in which policymakers vary by their pro-competitive or anti-competitive biases, and there is a way to sort of build financing into all of this. But I guess the more immediate question is whether you know something about the finite deadline of a policymaker.
Yeah, it's a good question. So just generally, that's right. We have a strategic policymaker, strategic self-interested policymaker, but we don't model political competition. There's only one policymaker, there's no election. And I think that's a very natural way to go here. And I think I mentioned it earlier, sort of we were thinking about sort of re-election as some sort of disciplining on the policymaker's ability to extract rents. Like if you go to Google and say, give me all of your shares, that's the limit. You're going to get thrown out of office and probably arrested, but that's going to be the limit on the tool available to the policymaker. And so we're trying to, we think of this tool as a tool that's low enough under the radar that it's not going to get you thrown out of office, and that's why it's acceptable to use. And it's the discipline of elections that limits the tools. What can we say about that? I mean, I can speculate, but I don't think we have anything specific to add. I will say one concrete thing on the campaign finance. So in political science, like a common puzzle is why there is actually so little money in politics. Sort of why is it that, given the benefit firms get from political actions and policy, why is it that they're only spending like $10 million, $20 million rather than $10 billion? And sort of one answer we have is this, well, I guess I've still got this picture up on the screen, is it's sort of equilibrium that I pay along the path, and then I get to a point where I'm so far ahead technologically, I just don't need the politicians anymore. And I think, in a sense, that's Google and these big tech companies are like, what are the politicians going to do to me? They can't do anything. Now they've then freaked out because Elizabeth Warren came in with a new tool, which is I'm going to break you up. And this sort of neo-Brandeisian wave is rebalancing this game between them. This equilibrium I have on the screen is with a very limited tool. And so it's natural that the policymaker says, hey, we need a new tool then to come in and try to change this.
Goes back to this ex post expropriation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an acceptable way, breaking them up. Well, expropriation may not be the right word, but it's certainly like, somebody else is getting the surplus.
It's a different tool.
Yeah.
Yep.
Whether it's the policymaker getting the tool, getting the rents or not, somebody else is getting those rents. And so, maybe this is why we're seeing a huge onslaught of money spent by the tech sector. It's ramped up. It's still not of the order of magnitude they should be spending, but it certainly has ramped up a lot in the last few years. And I think that's because new tools have come into play, and these tools can threaten them, whereas the market can't.
So what does should be spending mean in that sentence, Steve?
Well, I mean, like what does Facebook should be spending? What's the company worth now? Like $800 billion. Breaking them up, they should be spending the billions of dollars on this campaign.
Maybe,
but they're not even spending. Well, maybe they're spending $100 million now on it all.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a theorist sort of estimating empirically, but I think there's a lot at stake. I mean, Microsoft were getting broken up 20 years ago. That was a new threat. They certainly started to spend more. That's maybe a separate story, but I think these tech companies have definitely ramped up their spending an order of magnitude, and I think it's because new tools are available that threaten them.
Yeah.
Whether it's they should spend 100 million or 10 billion. Yeah, I'm happy to say that's a guess.
Just quickly, one more comment on that. So taking the sort of, I'm trying to think about the game that you have here in abstract terms. So I'm taking the tool of just separating the leader from the follower seriously for a moment. So this is a game, I can think of this as a game in which there is sort of a policymaker or a designer who can choose the set of players who are playing this game. And just a very speculative thought. I'm trying to think, where else do we see this kind of setup in which you can restrict, or there's a designer who naturally restricts the set of players, and there is a game that sort of generates rents, and the designer is interested in those rents. One thing that comes to mind are voting rights. So voting, like over history, there's always been sort of, we've had the struggle of extending the voting rights to more and more groups. And we might think that the rents of doing so are depend on polarization. And it's when things are very polarized and rents are large that we might see a lot of sort of the designer, whoever is in power of enfranchisement, as having the highest leverage possible. So I wonder whether you've made these sorts of connections that go beyond the market competition and the.
That's an excellent way of framing the result and thinking about it. We have thought a little bit about this, the suffrage question and the expanding the vote question, and I think a large part of that literature on sort of why did the British in the Second Reform Act expand the suffrage is that it's an irreversible change, but it has that same logic that I have more power with a smaller electorate. If I increase the electorate, I lose a lot of power, and sort of these huge streams in political economy and economic history have sort of on institutions have focused on that trade-off, but they tend to think of it as a irreversible change, that once you give people democracy, short of a full-on revolution, that you can't back it up.
Could I pitch in first?
Sorry, I'm just thinking about voter suppression, right, as a way to sort of take those rights away, which is very timely.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so that when I say it's irreversible, you can give them the vote, but you can then suppress that vote. And that may be an example of a limited tool. They would love to just take away the vote altogether, but they can't do that. And so they suppress it. And so, yeah, you're changing the population who gets to make that decision. Yeah, I can see that connection.
Could I just chip in on that? I mean, on this idea of managing competition so that there's different rents around that I can extract. There's a stream in platform in platform management around that. Like, does Amazon want to have a ton of people there? Well, if it's extracting from the sellers, then lots of identical people and no surplus it's not obvious that that's what they want. And so there is this kind of stream within thinking about platforms that says, well, I want to manage carefully who's around so that they can have enough rents that allow me to extract. Now, that's a two-sided market, and that leads to complications, but that kind of broad idea I'm sure you'd find it if you look around in like Hadju and Wright or something.
I think I've heard dating apps have a similar problem of balancing men and women on the site.
I'll defer to your greater experience on that, Steve.
I think on this note, maybe we can head on towards ending of the recording. But first, I would like to thank Steve for the excellent presentation, our panelists for the brilliant discussion that they facilitated. It's obviously, we ran off the time and we could go on and on. We can still go on after the recording is off.